Good morning.
Good morning.
So Nancy, I'm not sure whether you and I have met. I'm John Warner,
And I'm with the American College of Physicians.
Okay, very good. All right, Nancy. So,
How
yeah,
about you?
I'm advisory to ORCHA in the US. I'm based in California.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that on other calls, I think.
Yeah.
Lots of different people involved in this initiative. It's interesting.
Oh, yeah, big time. Yeah. Well, getting into the States is a complex affair, from a regulatory and other perspectives. So.
Yeah, and this topic in particular is complicated in the US.
Sure is. Yeah. Hi, Kinley. Hi,
Hi,
Matt.
Kinley.
Hi. Good morning. Nancy, I feel like you should be, you could be moderating all these meetings from now on. You've been to so many of them. It's nice to see a friendly face that's consistent.
Yeah, but this one's really getting beyond my expertise, but that's okay. We have Deja and it's not beyond her expertise. It's perfect.
Speaking of which.
Hello.
Hello. Good morning, Jerry.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, John.
Excellent. I've been having some microphone troubles.
Oh. Success. Anybody have good Memorial Day weekend plans? I feel like the country's going to explode with, people trying to get out. So I'm a little nervous about leaving, but I'm hoping to get away a little bit too.
Where to, Kinley? Where are you going?
I'm actually going to upstate New York, which is not necessarily the most exciting place, but I have a son who's starting to look at colleges. So it's a good excuse to drive 3 or 4 hours out.
Where are you looking in upstate New York?
He's interested actually in Vassar. So we're looking at Vassar. We might try to get up to Bard also while we're there. And then maybe Wesleyan on the way back through Connecticut. So it's weird going now though, because all the campuses are closed. So you're just sort of doing a drive-by and trying to peek in a little bit here and there. And it's mostly empty. So, but it's better than nothing. It's also just an excuse to get out.
I actually went to law school at Syracuse, so I think you'll have a good time if you get an opportunity. Go visit Green Lakes.
Okay,
it's really nice.
Green Lakes, is that a park?
Yeah, well, it is a state park, but there's also a lake, and I believe it's Onondaga County. So if you're near there.
Yeah, we were gonna see if we could actually get up to Syracuse as well. We're trying to figure out how long if we want to really stay for 2 days and face the traffic coming back on Monday, or just make it an overnight trip. So, but thanks, that's a great tip. We were trying to figure out what else to do because I'm going with my daughter who's already sick of all these college tours. So
yeah, it'll probably be nice to be outside then.
Yeah.
Colgate's very nice.
I've just got my daughter back from New York this weekend. Actually, she had she was on a 2-month course at the New York Film Academy. So
oh wow,
we had a hell of a job getting her over there, and a bit of a tricky job getting her back. But she's managed. So she had a wonderful time. But yeah, so she's in quarantine now and still on New York time, I think, a little bit. But
was she able to get vaccinated while she was in the US?
Not vaccinated, no. Several tests, but not vaccinated.
That's too bad.
So she had no problem getting tested, but no, she didn't get vaccinated.
Got it.
That's
Kinley,
interesting.
who else are we waiting for?
So we're waiting for Lasad, Sarah, Salachi, possibly G, possibly Chris Logan. They both said maybe.
Got it.
and Brian Hasselfeld as well.
Okay. Do you want to harangue them or?
Yeah, maybe I'll email them.
Hi, Nancy. Hi, Jerry.
Hi, Anne.
Nice to see you both. And is it
Deja,
Deja?
Deja
Okay.
is
Okay.
new to this group, but she's been fully briefed and has been working at ACP on this topic for over a year now. So
Got it. Nice to meet you. Welcome.
It's nice to meet you as well.
I've gotta do a confession before we start, Deja. Is I've started reading that paper and I haven't got through it all yet. It's really good, but please don't test me on it just yet. Maybe the
No
next
worries. No worries. I appreciate it.
I just emailed them.
yeah, for those of you that did get that paper, Brooke Rockburn was the other author, and Brooke was with ACP and involved in this project and just recently left for another position. But Deja worked with Brooke on all of the work, so she knows it all too.
Jerry, what's new with you?
Oh, did my first overnight away from home yesterday. We stayed with my mother-in-law, starting to help her clean out her house so she can move. That was my exciting weekend outing.
Good on you. That's awesome.
I'm gonna give them 30 more seconds
And then go.
and then we'll go.
Okay.
Oh, Brian is not coming. He's on paternity leave. Well, that's nice. Let me see if I can get Lasad on. Otherwise, I think they may join later. Maybe we should just get started because it's 11:06 already and we actually have quite a bit to talk about.
Right.
So thank you guys for joining us on a Monday morning and being punctual. So I think, as all of you know, this is part of a series of meetings to get to the end point of developing an evaluation framework for assessing digital health apps in the US. So we've had meetings on technical security as well as clinical effectiveness. And we will have follow-ups for both of those topics as well. But today's topic is on specifically around data and privacy. And our colleagues at ORCHA, mainly John, who is the expert here, will be talking about what they're doing at ORCHA right now around this topic, how they look at it, the key principles and their frameworks. And we just want to get some feedback from you of what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what might be missing, and go from there. And our expectation, likely, just like we had with the other two topics, is that there probably will be a follow-up to go in a little bit deeper dive into the specifics around how the assessment will work. That may be with a smaller group of people once we get down to a little bit more detail. But this is at kind of at a high level to think about how they're looking at it right now, and how we might want to look at it differently in the US. Hi, Sarah. So maybe we'll just do a really quick round of introductions, and then I'll hand it over to John. Nancy, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm Nancy Matthews with the American College of Physicians. And my role in this is overseeing all of our digital health activities and pulling in the right people at the right time so that our physician members, we have 160,000 physician members of the American College of Physicians. So we're here to represent them.
Deja, you want to go next?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Deja Johnson, and I'm an associate in the public policy and government affairs team at the American College of Physicians. I wear a few hats at the college. I lead our CPT ruck work, but most relevant to you, I also lead our HIT portfolio, focusing primarily on interoperability, privacy and security, compliance in general. So it's great to meet you, and thank you for inviting me to your discussion.
Thank you. Jerry?
Yeah, I'm Jerry Baumblett, and I currently work with DACLA, which is a social good patient education and clinician education platform. And I've been working in that field of patient and family engagement for over 20 years.
Great to have you back. And then Sarah, you want to go next? Introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Salachi. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer and Senior Managing Director for Innovation and Digital Health at Mass General, and was really excited to participate in the last session. So happy to be here today.
Thanks. We're glad to have you back. ORCHA team, do you guys want to introduce yourselves? Sarah, you want to start? Sarah?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sarah Arif. I'm one of the implementation managers at ORCHA and one of the account managers for ATA.
Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Fuller. I'm a business analyst here at ORCHA. So work on a variety of projects, but great to be involved with this one.
John, do you want to go next?
Hi, my name's John McGovern. I'm the sort of acting Chief Information Officer for ORCHA, and I've been involved since the start of ORCHA in the development of the data and privacy section of the ORCHA review process. I also do a lot of work and have worked in the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, for 20 years, particularly around secondary use of data, clinic health, medical, social care data. So my background is in the NHS, and I continue to still work in the NHS alongside ORCHA.
Other John?
Hi, folks. John Warner. I'm based in California. I'm an advisor to ORCHA at the moment in terms of their entry into the US on the strategy side. All my work is in the digital health and technology sector in healthcare. Thanks.
And Matt?
Hi, so yeah, I'm Matt Leahy. I'm one of the senior digital health assessors at ORCHA. So my main role, particularly with projects like this, pretty much it's really getting involved in the building of the assessments, making sure we get all the right all together and everything sort of actually flows and runs smoothly with it.
And then Anne, did you want to say hi?
Just to say hello and thank everyone for participating in this really important effort. I know that it has been a series of meetings, and we appreciate your participation and look forward to moving this all along. So I'll let you take it from there, Kinley.
Well, I'm actually going to let John take it over, actually.
You haven't introduced yourself, Kinley.
Oh, I think everyone knows me. Well,
everyone knows you.
Maybe. Well, Deja, I think this is the first time we've met. I'm an advisor with the ATA. I've been in healthcare for about 15 years, working basically in digital transformation with a large healthcare system in Boston, and then with a startup company managing basically digital health. But I'm working with Anne at the ATA and with the ORCHA team as kind of project managing on the ATA side.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, and let me know if you can see it when you can see it. So I think the plan for today was just to have a quick 15-20 minute sort of introduction to the way ORCHA have approached developing the data and privacy element of the ORCHA review. So obviously the slides we've had our introductions. We'll just go through the underpinning principles of what kind of has driven us around the development of the ORCHA privacy section, and then it's primarily focused because obviously we were UK and EU based with driving compliance with the GDPR. However, I think we believe, and we started to work outside EU boundaries quite a bit recently, that the principles stay attached. And I was very interested in reading Deja's paper, where the principles that you've come up with in that paper, I think, are very, very similar and very aligned to the ones that we use. So we'll do a quick run through the principles, the user rights And one of the kind of the approach we take with a very sort of crude example data flow architecture that I've come across in the health service. And then so hopefully that will take maybe 10-15 minutes, and then we've put together a set of questions that you hopefully will have seen, and hopefully those questions will then drive a set of discussions for the remainder hour or so of the meeting. So if that's okay with everybody, I'll crack on. So initially, can everybody see the slides? Yeah. Hello?
Yep, we can see the slides.
Right, that's good. Okay, sorry, I thought I'd lost everything then. So essentially, obviously, when we started off 5-6 years ago, and this was pre-GDPR, but we were fundamentally focused on data privacy within apps and digital health tools. And initially it was the UK Data Protection Act, which got updated in 2018, and then followed quickly by the European GDPR, the General Data Regulation. Both of those legal frameworks for us fundamentally have the same principles about, and we'll come into them in a little bit more detail in a minute. And it's looking, the ORCHA process at its core is looking for compliance with those principles. So the questions that we ask are trying to deduce from either looking at the app, reading the privacy policies, reading the terms and conditions, and actually trialing the app itself in the review process, is we're trying to find evidence that what they say they're doing with your data is actually what they are doing. And obviously in certain more complex data environments, we've moved on to an enhanced review process where we actually request behind the scenes kind of documents that they wouldn't necessarily make public, and then we got a much more robust check on the kind of processes they have in place internally and so on to validate even further that they are adhering with the principles. And I've just made the point that while the principles that we're applying might not be necessarily aligned with the legal structures and frameworks in other jurisdictions, other nations, from our perspective, the principles of GDPR are actually correct when you come to data privacy. They are the kind of things that everybody, we believe, should be looking for in terms of protecting the integrity of data, the integrity of confidentiality, and obviously there's an even higher standard required when you're looking for health data and care data. So just to blast through it. So the GDPR is built on 7 core principles. The first one is that you have to have a lawful basis for collecting data in the first place. And there are 6 lawful bases that are generally used, and they're built into the GDPR, and they're also built into our Health and Social Care Act and a few things that we have in the UK. We'll come on to them in a few minutes, the specifics, but for apps, primarily the one we have that we use the most, or we see the most, is personal patient consent. So when you're signing up or registering for an app, generally that's where you're basically providing your consent for them to take your data and to utilize it in the way that they describe utilizing it in the terms and conditions and the privacy policies. But so you have to have a lawful basis for collecting the data in the first place. The second principle is around purpose limitation, and that is about saying, well, we're very clear about why we need your data. We're going to be very transparent about why we need your data. So we are only going to collect your data to deliver this service back to you, or to support the functionality of the app, or and that's all we're going to use it for. We're not going to then collect it, sell it on for advertising purposes or whatever afterwards, or if they are going to do that, to make sure that they're very clear and transparent about doing it. The third principle is data minimization, and that's the principle of we will only connect the data we need to serve the purpose we've agreed, and nothing else. We won't look for loads of extra data just for the sake of it. We will only collect the data that we need to deliver the service to you that you've signed up for. 4 is around accuracy. So that is about the collector of the data, the app or the digital health tool, having a responsibility to maintain the accuracy and not to adjust the data once they've received it, not to adapt it, amend it, and do anything untoward with the data once they have it. Principle number 5 is around storage limitation. So we will only store this data for the length of time that we need your data for. And that's where it's very important that there's clarity around not only the period of time that they're going to collect your data for, but also how they're going to destroy it safely and protect your confidentiality when that data is there's no longer a need to have that the identifiable the sensitive data that they might hold about you. Principle 6 is around the integrity and confidentiality and the responsibility of those apps and app developers and organizations who are collecting your data to act with integrity and to maintain and protect the confidentiality of the users that it has. And finally is principle number 7, which is around accountability, and that's about taking responsibility for the actions that happen if there were a breach of their tool, if your data got lost, etc. So those are the 7 core principles, and fundamentally they I think they're international to a large extent. They can apply just as easily. You know, generally that if an organization is signed up, not only in the logistics of it, but in the spirit of these principles, they will not use your data for the wrong kind of purposes. You know that if an organization is very clear about what it's using it for, you know if it's very clear that we're only going to capture 2 or 3 identifiable data fields related to you, we are only going to keep it until you deregister, and once you've deregistered, we'll destroy it, and here's how we're going to destroy it. I think that sense of trust and transparency is built by the clarity of those principles. So just moving on. So we touched on the lawful basis in the EU and the GDPR, the 6 lawful bases. One is consent, and that's the one that we see most in terms of ORCHA, the kind of apps that we have that we're reviewing, or the digital tools that we're reviewing. The user will generally have given consent at the point of registration. Now, obviously, that's one. So if that's one that we're within the privacy assessment process. We ask a lot of questions about consent. Is it clear? Does it provide information about why the data is being collected and what's going to happen? And does, in terms of the principles we touched on, what happens if I'm not in a position to give informed consent? What happens is there a capability for others to act on my behalf? And have I given consent for that, and so on? So that's the primary lawful basis that we see in terms of digital tools in the healthcare. However, if with my other hat on, working within the health system, we obviously have an awful lot of we use public task and vital interests on some of the data sharing that goes on between hospital systems, and where patient data is transferred around the system from a specialist to another specialist, from a hospital to another hospital, from the GP practice, the primary care health service back into the secondary care health service, or where social care is involved. So we tend to, those 3 would be the most regular that we would come across. ORCHA, in some cases, for example, the lawful basis for ORCHA collecting certain data is that if we don't collect that data, we can't deliver the ORCHA platform in the way that you've contracted us to do. So in those kind of scenarios, you would use the supporting a contract to be the legal basis that you're collecting that data for. And then the legal obligation one is obvious. So that's if the data is required from under a legal obligation, then obviously that's a legitimate reason for collecting it. And then the last one is legitimate interest, and in reality, we very rarely use that because it's a little bit too vague and is very open to interpretation. So, and where there's, I think, where there's interpretation and fluidity in that way, there's also a lot of, it's very difficult to be clear and transparent. So that's one that I have very rarely seen used, and we would generally recommend against, because you know, if you can't have a lawful basis from one of the other five, then I think we have you struggle a little bit. So alongside the principles and the legal basis, GDPR protects 8 basic user rights, and we in our review process are checking for each of these very, very specifically, because everybody that holds data, certainly around a European citizen or a UK citizen, has to be capable and show how they are supporting these following rights. So you have the right to be informed, and that's about who's collecting your data, what they're doing with it, where it's going, where it's being stored, and what they want, what they're planning to utilize it for, what your legal basis for collecting it is. All of those are rights that a user can basically must have. The right of access, which, as it says, is allowing me to get a copy of my own data as held by an organization or a tool or a product if I request it. The right to rectification is obvious in that you always have to have the right to correct any incorrect information that the tool or the organization might hold about you, whether it's date of birth or address or whatever it might be. Excuse me for a second. You have the right to erasure, and this one has been quite difficult and has caused a lot of conflict over the last few years as GDPR has bedded in. But it's essentially about how once your data has been used and finished and the purposes and the limitations have passed, it should be able to be completely removed so that it's never trackable back to where it was originally. So you have the right to get all of your records that any company holds taken away, taken complete. Now, there are certain situations, obviously, where some of the legal bases overwrite that, but in general, the public would, particularly with a digital tool, you have the right to request that your data gets deleted. You have the right to restrict processing. So in some tools where there are multiple different types of processing, you have the right to say, I'm happy for you to process my data for purpose A and for purpose B, but I'm not happy for you to use it for purpose C. And in some cases, we're coming across more and more where there's sort of automated decision-making processes used by computers. And the best example I can think of is applying for a bank loan or a mortgage. If you have the right to say, no, I don't want my data, electronic data to be used in that way, because that can have a negative effect on my outcomes. I want to sit down and talk to an individual. And in the same way with a digital tool, the end users and have the right to define what they're happy to process and what they're not. You have the right to data portability, and this is one about allowing your data to shift from tool to tool. So if I've used a health and fitness app that has been collecting data about me for a year, 2 years, I have the right then, if I decide to use and take up a new app, to get my data from the old app transferred to the new one. We see it a lot in obviously in changing bank accounts. We see it in changing primary care practices and so on. So organizations have to be capable of providing the data to the users in a format that allows it to be imported relatively straightforwardly and reasonably into another tool. I have the right to object, and this is similar to the right to restricting processing, that I can ask for certain things that the tool is doing to stop doing those things with my data. And again, this comes back down to the use of AI, particularly and automated decision-making processes. And again, then that's further strengthened by I have rights in relation to automated decision-making and profiling. So between the principles, between the legal basis and between the user rights, the ORCHA review tends to focus on our questions are built around each of those principles. And it's, as I said at the beginning, it's about checking whether the privacy notices, the policies that are made public, the way that the apps and the tools are advertised, the way that they're presented, we're going through our questions are designed to check if have I got the right to be informed? Is it explicit? Have they shown me who I need to contact if I feel I'm not being informed? Have they shown me how I can make a request to access my data? Have they told me how long they're keeping my data for? And if not, obviously, if you're not capable of responding, or we're not capable of finding the evidence to support some of those claims, then those apps under the data and privacy section in the ORCHA assessment will not achieve high levels and will not basically be validated as strong in the data privacy and assessment period.
John, a quick question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Does GDPR specify a time frame within which they must respond? You know, we've had under HIPAA, for example, 30-day turnaround time for things like right to access. It's come down to 15, I think, in the recent rules in December. Well, what's GDPR say?
It does. I think it's 28 working days. I think you have to respond with the answer in 28 working days. You have to respond to the initial inquiry within 48 hours, I think, with a plan for how you're going to give the full details within 28 days. There's a crossover here as well, because we do have a Freedom of Information Act as well, which also defines some of those terms. So at the moment, there's obviously post-Brexit, there's still a bit of grey area. The UK has been granted temporary adequacy alongside GDPR, but it is looking internally at its own rules, specific rules on those areas. There is a time frame, defined within GDPR. Okay. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Others will know more than me. I think we came down from 30 working days to 15 in December, but that's fine. Let's move on. We'll come to it later.
Yeah.
Actually, John, John, I wonder if you could just clarify for everybody then, just which I think you already said, but just to clarify. So the way you assess these things is looking to see if they have that information somewhere available. So you look at their policies, their written policies and consents to see if they do any of these things. Is that how you do it?
I think there's a mixture of, yes, we try and find any publicly available evidence that might be on a supporting website, on the policies, on the apps themselves. And the reviewers are also, while they're going through the review process, they're doing it with the app open in front of them and checking things and signing up to things and registering things. So sometimes Matt is probably better at providing examples, but sometimes you for example, with privacy policies vary significantly from incredibly poor and not very clear to excellent and really well structured against the principles and the basic user rights. So I think privacy policy is a huge source of information generally. You also find terms and conditions on the websites, and obviously by actually testing and trialing certain things, we've kind of become, for example, data storage. There are things you can assess once you've been reviewing apps for a while that you think, well, that doesn't fit with what they said they were going to do. So a simple example would be, we don't collect sensitive data, and then you sign up to the registration form and it's asking you for your ethnicity or your economic salary range or whatever it might be. And those under GDPR are termed as sensitive. So we have non-identifiable data, which is a sort of a fairly low threshold. You have personally identifiable data, which would be your basic name, date of birth, address, postcode, and then we have personally sensitive, which are things like healthcare, criminal records, gender, ethnicity, union membership, things like that. And if so you can see very clearly if the privacy policy says we don't collect sensitive data, but on the registration form it's asking you for sensitive data, then those kind of it's a kind of a triangulation of evidence and testing on the app itself.
Great, thanks.
The other thing with the questions is one of the principles we had when we started was that all the questions have to be objective, essentially a yes or a no answer, because we couldn't have a situation where a reviewer started and it was a very subjective. So I might think, oh, well, that's a good privacy policy, and you might think it's not a very good privacy policy. So we've tried to keep the questions as yes or no, which means that you sometimes have to ask 4 or 5 questions, each of them with yes or no answers, and it's the combination of the answers that ultimately help us build up the assessment result. So we will ask questions around, do I have the opportunity to give my consent to and is it a default that I opt out or a default opt in? Is it, so the questions are structured in that way always, so that we can have, it's not subjective on the part of the reviewer. You either have or you haven't. Does the privacy policy inform me about my how to access my data? Yes or no? And that's why there's probably I think that I'm not sure about the specific number of questions within the data and privacy section, Matt, but I think we're over 300 questions on the whole assessment process complete now. Is Matt, can you validate the numbers?
Yeah, so you're probably looking at about a third of those are covered by data, either the main data section, or we also have questions which sort of set the scene for the data section as well. So you're probably looking close on 100, or if not over 100 questions overall for the data.
Yeah, and fundamentally they're all surrounded around the 6 principle or the 7 principles, the 6 legal basis, and the 8 basic user rights. So I just wanted, so this is really the last slide. The next one is the last slide the one after this. But yeah, so we've developed the tools around those. We've focused on objective questions, and we're designing that's what the questions are designed to check. Does the tool tell me about the, now there is an element here, and we have to be honest about, which is people can lie, people can tell lies in their data processes, and people can tell lies in their privacy policy, but we have to take it on the basis of this is what they've written and this is what they've legally committed to. But and on that level of evidence, the enhanced reviews are looking much more deeper and starting to try and to validate some of that evidence much more clearly. But on the outline, the baseline review for ORCHA, we have to just take what's available to us and make that judgment as objectively as we can. Obviously, the stronger your adherence to those principles, the higher you're going to be rated in a data and privacy context within ORCHA. So so this final one was just about, so we're talking, that's the general ORCHA baseline app. Obviously, if we start talking about apps that are going to integrate with health systems, there's a higher standard required. And some of this touches on the data and security section and the interoperability sections, which I know you're meeting about elsewhere. But there is elements of this that certainly underpin some of the thinking behind the privacy. So if you're going to interoperate directly with health and social care with very sensitive clinical data, then these are additional things that we think have to be thought about from a digital developer's point of view. One is around consent, obviously, and there is a, you know, we could probably argue for 2 or 3 or 4 hours just on what is informed consent, what is explicit consent, what about proxy consent, and for those who aren't in a position or have the capacity or capability to give consent themselves. There's a huge area of work to be done around user authentication, because if you're going to share your patient generated records from a health and well-being app with your clinical record, we've got to be sure that Mrs. Jones on the app is the same Mrs. Jones in the clinical record. So there's a lot of electronic challenges and challenges around user authentication. Data capture and validation and quality, where obviously, you know, you have to be sure that particularly and that's starting to get into medical devices, but that, you know, if there's a sensor on my watch, it's not, you know, it's calibrated correctly and it is capturing a correct heart rate, not a vague heart rate, so to speak. And then the things we're looking for are the points of transfer, because those are the points that are vulnerable to breach. How the data has been stored is another sort of risk area. Who's accountable at data handover points? How are you destroying the data? And have you got good, strong processes in place if there are breaches? So those enhanced review, those areas come much more to play within the enhanced review process, and that is much more about requesting the actual policy documents, requesting some evidence of their data destruction policies, looking at how have they got a standard, international standard level security management approaches, etc. That level of assessment is we believe is required if you're starting to interoperate with the health service. And what this particular flow diagram, it was just one that we've been developing in the Lancashire region, and the Lancashire region is bringing together data from a whole load of individual organizations, both trusts and GP practices, and trying to create a PHM data warehouse, which is a population health management data warehouse, which would be available to analysts to look at population level analytics, some of it in an anonymized state, some of it in a pseudonymized state, some of it potentially in an identifiable state. And we have in the UK national data flows. So the local organizations submit regular mandated data updates, and those get brought together into national data sets. And what we were trying to show was, and the data sets in the red flows are where the data is flowing in an identifiable format to the national landing zone. And it's getting consistently pseudonymized in the national landing zone and then passed into national dashboards. So there's a national data warehouse where you can go on and have a look at national rates for hospital admissions and rates for outpatient attendances and so on, waiting list rates. But that's in a pseudonymized form. What we were trying to do is work alongside that and create some local flows that could then could actually be de-identified when the big secondary use analysis was completed. So you have a pseudonymized data here flowing, joining up with some of the national data that's flowing, getting transformed and loaded back into a local warehouse alongside the national data. And then within that warehouse, we would also have a de-pseudonymization process that would allow us to re-identify patients who were identified at risk, but only to the clinicians who needed to know or needed to treat them. But what we try and do with these data diagrams is to identify, well, we have the original data coming from the local organizations. It's going into a national team. So they're at one point a data processor on this flow, and we have to check, are they applying the right security? Are they applying the right governance constructions in their data warehouse? Then when they pass it onto the national environment, is it safe while it's being transited and transmitted? And then is it safe? So is the national team applying the same standards to their security standards to their warehouse? And is there the correct role-based controls to make sure that only people who have a right to see that data get to see it at the other end? And that's kind of taking a data flow journey from its origin to its endpoint through all the potential brokers that it passes is kind of how we're trying to enhance our privacy, security, and data management assessment processes by really looking for those transition points, looking for the data when it's in transit, looking at the data when it's in storage, and then making sure that when it's published eventually, that the right people, only the right people with the right responsibilities can access that data in whatever form they need. So researchers can access it in a pseudonymized form. Clinicians can see identifiable data, but only for patients they have a clinical relationship with. So I don't know, does that make any sense to people on the call? Hello? Sorry.
Yep, no, we're here.
Sorry, I can't see everybody's screen at the minute. Okay, so based on that, then we set up a series of questions, and we hopefully these will drive the discussion. Now, I don't know, Kinley, do we want to work through these, or do people want to suggest which questions they'd rather have a discussion about, or
Yeah,
has anyone got any
maybe we could
questions?
start with just questions first before we go into the discussion. If people had questions specifically on some of the slides that John just covered.
Yeah, I was curious to know, are all of the questions, because it sounds like there's a lot of them, those are available to the app designers and developers? Like, is that something they have visibility into before their app is being reviewed?
No, if we were working, I don't think so at the moment, Matt. I don't think we published the questions. I think what we do, obviously we publish the questions with clients like the ATA who are developing an assessment process, and that's exactly what we're doing. The plan is to adjust the questions that we've got to fit the needs that you have. So at the moment, what we're saying is we have a baseline set, and we might have to either adapt the terminology, adapt the language, add specific questions that you're requiring in your jurisdiction over and above what we would, potentially remove some of the questions that we ask because they're not appropriate in your. So one of the better examples at the moment that we're going through is in discussion with clients in Canada and Israel, is that obviously in the EU, if you're not storing your data in an EU-based data location, then there's a whole range of additional extra questions about what used to be the Privacy Shield, but it now is obviously as a result of SHREM 2, I think it is called, that court case in where the Privacy Shield has not been acceptable now as adequate from a GDPR point of view. So that there's a fundamental, but the answer to your question is we don't make those available to the developers. We make them available to the assessment side, not the development.
Maybe just clarify a couple things too. So I think we haven't talked in detail yet about what we're going to communicate when this gets rolled out, but I think the idea is that we would provide a fairly detailed description of what goes into the assessment. We might not have all 300 questions listed out, but I think we will have content in fairly good amount of detail. I think so we want people to trust it too, to say, here are the things that we look at. And so I think also just to the other piece that we probably haven't talked about in a while is that, ORCHA does do two different things. So we will probably put a bunch of apps through this assessment framework when we're ready to do that and we have a pilot. But there are also the opportunity for some data health app developers to go to ORCHA directly and say, hey, I would like you to review this, in which case they may get more detail. That's why they might go to the more extensive assessment that he mentioned in the data flow. Some of that stuff in the data flow, we wouldn't know objectively or from the public point of view, but they may go to ORCHA directly and say, we'd like you to actually assess our app. So that the question a little bit better.
There is a few. So there, on the website, the review process is public, and the steps that we take and how we work through it is all on the public ORCHA website. There's also, obviously, when your app has been reviewed, you get an app review card, which says these are the areas you are not, that this app is doing well in. So, and very often what we get is and that's sent to the developers before it's published. So effectively, the developer gets a chance to come back and challenge and say, well, hang on, you said I haven't got a data privacy, and yes, there is one. Here it is. In which case we can rectify those situations. So there is it's not about hiding the questions. It's just about making them available when it's appropriate. So yeah, go on the ORCHA website and you'll see the review process laid out step by step at a high level, and then look at an ORCHA review card and you'll see in the data and sections that this one was good on, didn't have a privacy policy, this one was excellent on that. So we are quite open, and as Kinley said, when we get into the enhanced reviews, that is very much a two-way conversation with developers. Thank you. Sorry, I got my daughter serving me water, which is great.
Are there any other questions on the slides? It sounds like Nancy, were you going to?
So I just wanted to, I think Deja had to step off for another call, but our answer to the first question is yes, that we're comfortable with the GDPR as a kind of an underpinning.
Yeah, because I think the principles on the paper that you've got on page 4 are actually very, very similar.
Yeah,
and they are so.
Can I ask one more question about the assessment, actually?
Go ahead.
Just to understand. So are you giving an overall score? Is there like a kind of pass fail, or are there certain things where they're weighted? It's like, well, if you don't meet, if the answer to these 3 questions is no, that's a much bigger deal than if the answer to these 25 questions is no. I guess I was just trying to get a better sense for, like, when it comes back. Like, I always found it helpful when I was developing decision aids, to your point, that I could look at the IPDAS criteria, and even internally at my organization, if they would push back on things, I'd be like, no, look, we have to do this, or when we submit this, it's going to get flagged as it can't be used at all because this one's like crucial versus this one is more of like a nice to have or better score. Yeah.
Yep. So I'll probably step up on this one as soon as I build the review tool constantly. So we do have, like, with the ORCHA baseline review, we have quite complex scoring sort of approach to it. So with each individual question, we'll determine whether or not we would assign it with risk or whether it would be a value-based question. So if something's a must-have, we say, well, it holds risk if it's not done. If something's a nice-to-have, then it can gain value if it is done. And alongside that as well, we sort of determine the level of risk or the amount of value that's being introduced by each of those different things. So, for example, with the data, if we don't see a privacy policy making it very clear that your personal or sensitive information is encrypted in transit and at rest, then we immediately say, well, there's a high risk associated with that because it could be easily accessed and intercepted. And we do that across, like, all areas of the review as well. And on top of that, with each individual question having some sort of level of scoring to it. We can apply certain tariffs. So with the data section in particular, if we know sensitive information is being collected, then there's more risk to be achieved than if it was just personal or if there was non-personal data. And each of the different review domains as well. So because we obviously have a focus on data, we also look at professional assurance and usability and accessibility. Depending on the nature of the app and its functionality, we also will have different weightings and distribution to each of the sections. So for something that's a medical device, we would obviously put quite a lot more pressure around the professional assurance side versus something which is just a very bog standard, just a fitness diary or just images of fitness exercises. Then we might say was less clinical risk, less to sort of really look for on the professional assurance side. So we would move a bit more towards the usability. I think really with the baseline review, we pretty much stick to a very solid, the data section is always going to be the same regardless, because we have that sort of ratchet or tariffing system based on the nature of the data in each individual question. And so there's lots you can do because different people have different approaches. Like John mentioned, we've got Israel as another tenant. They don't want to have a scoring approach to it. So instead, all they've done is they're just going through and saying, well, any one of these questions is answered incorrectly, then it's an immediate fail. So as I say, there's loads of different ways in which we can sort of build scoring mechanisms or assessment approaches into whatever it is that the intended outcome is really.
I think there's a few other things to make here. So very early on in our development, 4 or 5 years ago, it became very obvious that it wasn't the only way you could fairly score was to try and group apps into peer groups. So we've created levels. So any app, for example, that's just that and functions, and the functions determine the levels. So an app that's purely for information, for example, signposts you to diabetes information, but doesn't actually collect any of your, so you download it and it's a useful links to here and links to there and some good advice, etc. Then because it doesn't collect your data, then obviously it stays into a level 1 type app. When apps start collecting your demographics, they go to a level 2, and obviously there's also question number 1 in the data privacy section is, do you collect personal data? If you say no, then there's 40 or 50 of the questions just immediately grayed out. So we have that kind of capability as well to be flexible about, if yes, if this is the answer is yes, then this question needs to be asked. If the answer is no, then don't ask that question and just move on to something else. And the score adjusts according to your levels. So the idea is that ultimately, when a user comes onto an app platform and looks for apps, the levels group the same types of apps. So you're not comparing an app that doesn't collect any data at all and gets a really high score because it's really low risk with an app that's actually really useful, but because it's collecting complex data is risky. So we're trying to find the balance so that the risky one is doing all of the right things, so it deserves just as high a score as the one that isn't taking any risks and gets a high score. So it's a very clever and complicated system, but I think we've refined it now to the point where it's very robust. And then, like Matt says, even after all that, you can just switch it off and go, no, we're having a pass or a fail. That question is a complete fail. If you don't answer yes to it, then you shouldn't even be playing. So you can adapt it for your purposes. Okay. So just one of the second question for me was quite a big one for us, because obviously we've still got to do some research into HIPAA, and we've started, but I'd be very interested to know if there are things that are very obviously that we've missed that would be needed in an American context.
Well, you have used the term, does the app collect personal data? And I think the question is, does the app collect personal health information? protected health information as defined under HIPAA.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I think the first thing is to make sure that PHI as legally defined, if that's how that's different from what you had mentioned in terms of the personal sensitive data and the personal health data.
So is the distinction, so I'm trying to think about the distinction between here would be name, date of birth, age, postcode, those kind of things would be personal information. When we get into the clinical side, it's then defined as sensitive. Now, there's no problem changing the terminology, but I suppose what I'm asking is, for apps or digital tools on your side where they're collecting the demographics but not the health, is that protected health information, or have you got that kind of a hierarchy of non-personal, personal, sensitive in the same way that we have? So obviously
Has John frozen on your side?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool.
He was in midpoint.
Yeah. Let me see if I can ping a message on Google.
You may even want to stop sharing for a second or something.
I think John's actually, oh, okay, he's gone off. Yeah, he was sharing. So let me put up the questions on the page so at least we can have a think about the questions before he comes back.
I suppose actually one question for me, just to sort of get a bit of clarity. So what, because you've obviously mentioned the fact that we'd need to be very clear and precise about definition of patient health information on the HIPAA. How, or do you know, or are you aware of how that sort of differentiates from what's sort of classified as sensitive information under the General Data Protection Regulation?
I'm not sure we have the right people to answer that. Potentially, we can find out, but there is a very specific definition for PHI, so we should just figure that out. And a couple of the people who could make it today could probably help us if there are any nuances that we need to be aware of. But there is a very specific definition for it.
apologies, I got my internet went down for a second there. I think, yeah, there are, and obviously the documents you've shared with us have been helpful. We just haven't been able to go into the granularity of it fully yet. But yeah, that's one of the areas I think would be very interesting. In terms of outside of it, in terms of the principles, though, is there any principle that we've missed that you would apply, or are there principles that we've listed that wouldn't necessarily be considered as important? I think is the other question for me.
If I could just go back to HIPAA for a minute, and this is really not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that the issue is that an app owner, developer may consider themselves not to be covered by HIPAA. They're not a covered entity because they are not a healthcare provider. But when they start to, move into this area, there's a gray area of providing health related advice and engaging with somebody in their health maintenance. They should be covered by HIPAA, and that's, I think, where the gray area exists, not in what is HIPAA data, but who does HIPAA apply to?
I think just very simplistically, to give a response to that, is that we treat all the reviews the same. So, and as an assessment, so if you're developing the assessment process in your place, I think what we would have to do is, that would be a question, obviously. And we would have a set of questions that would try and identify whether this organization should be HIPAA covered or not. I think we've done this very similar thing with the medical devices, where we have the gray area where certain apps, for example, taking blood pressure or HbA1c for scores or something from, and they say they're not a medical device. So as a result, they don't need the stringency. We have a set of questions that tries to identify, that basically assesses, we think this should be a medical device. And that then obviously then creates a big knock-on effect throughout the whole of the assessment. And it may be that we have to do something similar, is develop a set of questions that are like a HIPAA check. You know, given what you say you're doing, should you be covered properly under HIPAA protection? And if you are, yes, off you go. And if you're not, then that's a big red flag that comes out of the assessment process. Alternatively, there's a way of if you're developing the assessment for your purposes, it's about saying where you set the bar. And if you decide, actually, if there's any doubt at all, then that app is going to get a really low score. And that's a decision that you can make as the owners of the assessment platform. Where do you want to set your level of entry?
And I think our physicians would expect the level of entry to be pretty high. I mean, why? Because my concern is also that what an app is doing today can easily change 6 months or a year from now. And I know you can't assess for the future, but we're not going to be assessing these apps every month or two. So you have to question why an app would need to collect protected health information if it's not in one of these categories as a covered entity, then why even collect that data? So the fact, to me, the fact that they are collecting, if they are collecting protected health information, then why shouldn't they just comply with the HIPAA requirements?
Absolutely agree.
I guess further to that point, with in the clinical efficacy session, we talked about kind of the tiers of apps and how they can be used. I think we said off-label or for different unintended use. And I'm wondering if that could be the starting point for how you would potentially address then the data privacy issues in conjunction with those tiers. I mean, we have a pretty robust data security review process within MGB before we deploy an app clinically, but we're also, well aware people are just downloading apps and choosing to share their health, their MU3 data with all sorts of apps out there now. And I think it's a really complicated topic as you're pointing out, but there's not going to be a one size fits all solution. I don't know, like the GDPR principles, who wouldn't agree with them? I just don't know how easily they can be applied in this environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think there does come a point where, I mean, we're fully aware of the fact that we've created an app assessment process for health and well-being apps, but there are still people who are quite happily just going and downloading these apps from Google and coming nowhere near ORCHA. I think that the challenge has been to work with, certainly with the health services we're working with across the country, across the world, where it's not about general utilization in a sense. It's about, if you want to come and work with the health service, or you want to be accredited by clinicians, particularly, or professionals, then you're going to have to go through this assessment process. So, the public utilization of it in some ways is out of everybody's control. Like you said, but the bringing them into your environment in your entire health and social care economy, that is within your, is we have got a level of control on that, and that's where this, I think, is the start off. Obviously, we're trying to have the conversation, the bigger public conversation at the same time, because everybody should be, I think the general public, certainly over here, and I suspect it's exactly the same in America, we don't fully understand the scale at which our data is being abused in some ways, and our privacy is being abused, not just in the health environment, but obviously, social media, and we've seen it in our recent elections. I think you've seen it in your recent elections, how private data can be manipulated for nefarious purposes. But the challenge here, I think, is to focus on, if you want to play in the health space, that we can control, and then that's what we should be trying to focus on. And I think you're absolutely right about the HIPAA flagging up the HIPAA. If you are collecting that kind of data, you certainly, if you want to work and be accredited by professionals, then you should be signing up for HIPAA protection rules. And if you haven't, we're going to be asking very serious questions, or we're going to be limiting your ability to work in this market. And I think you have to draw those lines.
So John, I stuck a question at least in the chat, but just to illustrate, I'm working with a digital health startup company now, which is in the wellness space, and they don't see themselves to be in the healthcare space, and that's just their view of the world. They're really measuring, they're asking one question, which is, how anxious do you feel? And in-app, you score that on a scale of 1 to 10, and you might argue that that's starting to get to health, but they weren't HIPAA covered in any way, shape or form. But they've just done a deal with a major hospital provider system, in which, under chronic care management, they now want to envelope blood pressure data and see if there's a correlation between hypertension and high blood pressure and high anxiety. They were not ready at all for the interoperability of that data set in a patient population they wanted to trial. They wanted to trial 400 patients, I think it was, using this. So that's why I wonder if the question is, if we accept they were right in not being HIPAA compliant or needing to be HIPAA compliant at the beginning, are they ready to be? Is that part of how ORCHA either currently assesses, their readiness for that journey, or should they be in the future? That's where my question came from.
Yeah, I think there's a few things. So we've managed to, I think, and Matt can back me up on this or challenge me on this if you want, but there's levels of, so over here, there's levels of medical device compliance. There's a level 1 and a level 2, and if you get to the level 2s and the level 3s, that's when you need to go through the serious regulation. And I think what we could potentially do, the same thing, is to say, as Sarah said, one size fits all doesn't work. You have, if you've got these criteria, you can, we'll accept you without necessarily having to go through the HIPAA process. If you've got this level of criteria, then you should be going through the HIPAA process. But if you haven't, answering these questions in this way would effectively give you the same level of compliance. And I think there probably are quite a few questions in the ORCHA assessment process that could get you the equivalency of HIPAA without the stamp, if you see what I mean. So if you're doing that, and if you're doing this, and if you've got a good privacy policy, and if you're doing that, then you would pass the HIPAA assessment. And I think, so we have a bit of work to do to map what would be required of a HIPAA application and say, right, okay, well, those questions are the equivalent to these questions. And actually, we wouldn't be given HIPAA accreditation, but we would be doing what you've said. We're ready to be HIPAA compliant. And it might also help them in terms of identifying areas where they're possibly not ready, if they should be doing a HIPAA compliance. So I think there's definitely a really interesting piece here, specific based around that question, John. I think it's a really valid one. I'm not sure that I'd word the question in that way. I would check what, I suppose the question for us would be identifying a cohort of questions that, if answered in a certain way, would signify HIPAA, an adequacy with HIPAA, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that one of the things to sort of bring up as well, I suppose, is you would have to consider and make sure we structured things in a way which we either go down the route of we identify whether or not someone, based on what's sort of discussed in this session and sort of any following sessions, like what does make an app HIPAA sort of fall within scope of HIPAA. That will then allow you to determine whether or not we then start to assess someone against it, because it could then sort of be deemed as unfair to assess someone against a standard that's not relevant to them. But then to your point, John, where you said about this person didn't see themselves as needing to be HIPAA compliant, then they want to start like collecting all this blood pressure and sort of look at the data to see whether or not there's correlation between high levels of anxiety and high blood pressure. For that to occur, especially if it's being done through the app where they were then collecting that information, it would require an update which would immediately flag for us the fact that we'd need to re-review an app. Because they would need to also carry out updates on the app to be able to then have the functionality to support the collection of the data. And at that point, we would then probably go back in, do another review of the app because it needs re-reviewing, and we would then identify, well, actually, they should now be HIPAA compliant, which means in terms of finishing that second review, you'd then see the sudden change in the score where previously it may have scored all right on the data, but now because they're not HIPAA compliant and they need to be, the score would end up coming crashing down. And that sort of really goes for pretty much any app at any point whenever there is an update. We'll pick up on that, we'll do a re-review, so any functional changes will be captured. And that obviously goes for the clinical assessment as well. So where you were sort of saying about having the tiers, an app can suddenly change its functionality and it would suddenly go from being like a tier 2A to being a tier 3A app. So similar thing that occurs, and that's just something we constantly monitor. So I think that goes back to what John was saying about trying to sort of, when you were saying about like how we structured it, John, to try and make sure we aren't comparing two very different things, or what, like two apps, one which needs to meet a certain requirement, the other one doesn't. Because once we start doing that, it's a case of people will be penalized unfairly versus we can just proactively keep an eye for changes that they make to identify whether or not they should now be compliant with certain things.
Just sorry, you brought up something else there, Matt, as well. So I agree with all of that. We touched earlier about saying, you know, we don't re-review the apps every 2 or 3 months or whatever. We actually have a process in place where, because of the way we do a weekly scrape of all health and well-being apps from Apple and Google and the first thing we do with that data is to see if any of it's changed. So for example, if the previous scrape last week was version 1.1, and that's been like that for 6 months, then suddenly it's version 2.2 and they've released an update, then it gets put back into a re-review queue automatically. We also check for things like, so basically if an app, and I think we've kind of arbitrarily cut it off at about 18 months, I think. But if an app hasn't updated itself or been updated in 18 months, then they get taken off the waiting list and don't get reviewed, and you know, and their current review will get taken off the front end. Because our view was, if as a developer you're not staying up to date with releases around iOS and everything else, then you're not doing your work. So it's a kind of it's an arbitrary bar, but it was one that I mean, obviously it was for practical reasons to an extent, because you've got 130,000 apps, or no, I think it's 300,000 apps coming down a week. Usually that's about 150,000. Some of them would be duplicates because they'll be on Apple and be on Google, etc. But the kind of rules we said to kind of to filter it out, and again they're available on the website, the rules we use, but is if you're not updating your app regularly, then especially in this space, you should be, there's a warning flag going up that developers aren't keeping this maintained. If, on the other hand, they are updating it, then we have to put it into a re-review process to make sure that what we originally scored them as is still valid because of the changes they've made. So just to let you know that those two processes are automatically built in our underpinning review engine. So
That's great.
we,
Thank you for that clarification.
yeah, and while you're waiting for a re-review, there's a flag on your front end card on the ORCHA platform that it is, you know, this app has had a new release, this review relates to its previous release, etc. So and I think the same thing then comes into, because we have had situations where, like you said, you start off with the measure for stress, and then suddenly decide, right, we're going to add the capability to capture blood pressure. That would come under that re-review channel. And if you got in the stress one, you know, your low level and possibly not HIPAA, then the second one would definitely push you into the HIPAA bracket, and that would change the nature of the review you'd get the second time around. And it's very important for just that reason. You know, you can, as you develop, you can move up the medical device ladder effectively. So I think the process accommodates that, is what I'm saying, accommodates those kind of changes, and has to be fluid and has to be fair. There, you know, those are the things that we're trying to stick with it, you know. And like Matt said, it's not fair to mark somebody down because they're not HIPAA compliant when there's actually no reason for them to be HIPAA compliant. I mean, you know, if you're saying, do you protect PHI, is a totally different question from, are you HIPAA compliant? And if you can prove that you are really protecting PHI, you would then say, well, you should go and become HIPAA compliant because it validates what you're doing, but you may well be hitting all those standards anyway. And we'd probably need to be careful about not excluding those people from the innovation space just because they haven't got the HIPAA badge. And that's a conversation that, you know, you'll have to make a decision on. Ultimately, we can go either way with it. We can mark it or not mark it. You know, it could be a fail question if it says you should be HIPAA compliant and you're not. You haven't got the stamp, but yet you're doing all the ORCHA questions. That might be a fail in your terms, and to try and drive developers to go for HIPAA compliance.
Yeah, I think my understanding of HIPAA is that it's not really that it's based on, you're not asked to be HIPAA compliant based on functionality. It's really a legal thing, whether you're a covered entity or not, or you're a business associate. So it's really not about how high level the risk or the functionality is. It's really about your status in the healthcare ecosystem. So if you're a health system, you are a covered entity. But if you're a digital health app, usually you're considered a non-covered entity, so you don't have to be protected. You don't have to be HIPAA compliant. But I think what I'm hearing from everybody is that we want, even if you're not a covered entity, we would like you to be HIPAA compliant. So I think I'm seeing some nods. So I think what I would recommend is, because a couple of people who couldn't make it today are, you know, experts in this area, is that we'll have a separate meeting, John, with some of the folks that couldn't make it today, and we'll talk through that specifically. But it sounds like philosophically what everyone here is saying is, even if you're not considered a covered entity, we would like you to be HIPAA compliant in order to score high in this assessment.
Or at least have a plan to get there if required to do so on your journey.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is if a health app ends up integrating into a health system, they become a business associate, right? So if they're a business associate, then they have to be HIPAA compliant. So there's some like stuff there that we should just figure out. And it's not really just if you have this kind of functionality, you have to be HIPAA compliant. It doesn't really work that way. You could be the most complicated, you know, functional app in the world, and you might not actually be protected under HIPAA. So maybe we can put that aside, and we'll have another separate conversation with kind of the information legal experts in that field to figure out where that is. What I'm hearing from everybody is that we would want to kind of, you know, go to that sort of higher
promote
standard.
promote HIPAA compliance. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think. I mean,
Also-
I think from our side, what we're saying is, whatever you decide, I think we can accommodate.
That's good.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that's other than HIPAA? Is there anything else that's missing that you think is important that we should be looking at?
I think it's hard to look at this too in the vacuum without information security, because I know one of the things we worry about is personal devices where we've prescribed an app for the purposes of clinical care. That phone, that device gets hacked and that data is accessed. Or what is our liability if that data is accessed, knowing that we prescribed the app. And so the person I was hoping that could join today from our legal team couldn't make it, but I think bringing together the data security with the information IA security, I think will be important too.
Yeah, it's a very interesting challenge because obviously that is one. I mean, ORCHA as a platform, we're not recommending apps. What we're saying is,
Right.
If you're using this app, here's some information to help you make a decision about whether to use this app or not. And it is a really tricky legal minefield, effectively, about well, if that person used the app and it caused harm, who is responsible? And I think it's I'm not even sure it's a data security and privacy. It's more of an ethical and clinical assurance question in some ways, where you have, obviously what we're trying to say is if you do all of these things in data privacy and if you do all of these things in data security, you're minimizing the chance of bad stuff happening. And likewise with the clinical assurance process that we're trying to, so you've got evidence that you're protecting my data as much as you possibly can. You've got evidence that you're securing my data while you're holding it. You've got evidence that the clinical claims you're making for your app has got some evidence base behind it, research, etc. And that's kind of where the whole ORCHA assessment has evolved to. But it still kind of leaves that tiny gray area about accountability and liability if something went wrong. And I know that's certainly a massive issue for clinicians, because if we move away, ORCHA is not recommending, but if a clinician was starting to go to a patient, I think you should use this app. It would help you manage your condition, and then something goes wrong, and that's a huge liability. But then there's a question about, well, if the app isn't doing what it's claiming to do, shouldn't it be the app developer's liability, effectively, the owner of the apps? So I think, yeah, there's definitely a really interesting conversation there. I'd love to hear the legal expertise and the legal view on it.
I think what was sort of being alluded to there, because you mentioned sort of like the information security side, that's very much with part of sort of conversations in one of the other workshops we've already had, which was looking at security and technical stability. And I know one of those discussion points, which is one we'd be picking back up on, was the idea of sort of code reviews. So it's the developer's responsibility to ensure that they are sort of run tests against the code to make sure that any attack surfaces are as protected as possible. I know sort of we had that initial discussion. Really, the next step is to sort of decide on what the best way, being able to sort of bring that into the assessment, because I know one of the big things, especially with something like that, was where does the liability lie even on us when it comes to sort of doing the assessments? Because if we say, oh yeah, they're nice and secure, they've done the code review, there's no attack surfaces, and then something happened, does that liability fall to us because we said it was okay?
Yeah.
So I know there's been some discussions on that.
I mean, I don't know the legal view, but the GDPR talks about taking every reasonable step. It doesn't talk about it being risk-free, because I don't think it ever can be risk-free. None of this can be. There's always a hack. You can do everything you can possibly do, encrypt and transmit and secure your databases and role-based access control, and you can still get hacked with someone with the right skill. It is about making sure and building the trust. We talked about this very early on. is all about being transparent and showing that you are doing everything you possibly reasonably could be expected to do to prevent harm. But you know, it'll never be risk-free. You know, whatever I mean, standard clinical procedure is not risk-free. You know, you know, that's part of that the world we work in. I do think though that there is real potential here for developing a much clearer framework about ownership. And we have, the GDPR has the concept of data owner and data control, or data controller and data processor. And the data controller is the person who commissions the app, dictates the use of the data and but it might not be the person who's processing it. So they'll subcontract to an app developer to build a database and to do the processing on their behalf. And that person is the data processor. So the responsibility and liability for a breach of the data always lies with the controller. And obviously they have legal contracts that can then pass that liability down to the processor if the processor haven't done what they were contracted to do. Now, I'm wondering whether there's an equivalent controller processor kind of definition around who owns the data. So if a hospital system commissioned the development of a specific app, I'm assuming the hospital would be the, you know, our equivalent of a data controller, and they would be the ones responsible for anything going wrong. If it's a private sector provider, they're the data controller. And we are finding cases now where you have app developers who, for example, build the app, but the data never leaves your phone. And in those scenarios, you're the user becomes the data controller, because the user can dictate what at the data and when to release it and who to share it with. And there's a whole load of serious, really interesting questions there as well, I think, which probably run in parallel to the legal, the clinical liability question around. So the data liability question, if you got a data breach as opposed to a clinical safety issue, who's liable for that, and where is it liable? So it might be very useful session to have just on the legality of liability, if you want to call it, and across both privacy and clinical safety, I think.
So I just wanted to point out that it's 12:31 actually. So this is actually very helpful, John. Thank you. I think it was helpful just to see a little bit more, learn more about GDPR, which I think is in many ways, as we were thinking before, it might actually be stronger than what we even have in terms of regulations here. But I think what makes sense is to have another follow-up meeting with some of the folks who couldn't make it today. And maybe Sarah, we could invite Terry to that as well, and talk a little bit more in detail about sort of the legal terminology and how that plays into it. And then, as I said in the beginning of the meeting, there probably will be a second round of all of these different topic areas to get a little bit more detail around what are the questions that we ask and how we want to manage some of that stuff. So, but the purpose of today was really just to get a very high level kind of, does this seem to make sense from you? Which it sounds like it is, but there's some follow-up we need to do. So I really thank you for that. And then, I'll have some notes to share with all of you, but we'll follow up with the right folks. Any of you who want to be involved at however level of detail you want to be involved, we welcome you. But otherwise, thanks very much for your time. And
if there's any questions, fire them away, fire them to us directly if you think of things afterwards. But I hope it's been a useful session.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Thanks a lot.
Bye.